test when he arrives here later today. The Democrats are not going to have control of the House of Representatives, and so the fate of progressive immigration reform probably will take a back seat again, at least for 2 years. So the history of the country, as especially for those of you who have grown up in the United States, is very much labeled and exalted as a nation of immigrants, and that's only part of the truth. Obviously, the United States is a grand experiment that we're all a part of, and it's come at the expense of others, this experiment. But it is an unusual country in the sense that it may not have begun very diverse, but it is today very diverse, very much because of immigration policies. There were no immigration laws to speak of until the second president of the United States, and that was John Adams, when he was concerned with radicalism, with the French Revolution, and concerns that there may be security problems. And so the first immigration law was passed during his presidency, which was labeled an anti-sedition law, and it was couched in terms of keeping people out that were advocating a different, more revolutionary type of government. And so that was the first law that was on the book, and it's interesting that those types of provisions came to the forefront throughout many periods of U.S. history, including the 1940s and the 1950s, when there was strong anti-communist provisions that were added to the laws, and then up to the President Trump's presidency, when he actually sought to invoke national security following he invoked national security for many of his executive orders, and it fell right in line with provisions of the immigration laws that were changed after 9/11. 9/11 severely impacted immigration laws because after September 11, 2001, the Department of Homeland Security was established, and it didn't exist before 9/11. And ever since then, every immigrant visa, every non-immigrant visa, every refugee visa, every asylum application is viewed through the lens of national security. And Donald Trump took full advantage of that sentiment during his presidency. But after the Adams presidency, the first immigration laws that we saw actually were aimed at Chinese. Many of you are familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act that passed in 1882. And it was based primarily on race, but also on economics. That it was viewed that Chinese just didn't fit in to the picture of what an American could be. They spoke differently, they ate differently, they had different habits, but also Chinese were undercutting, it was alleged, undercutting the migrants from other parts of the world that came primarily to the West Coast. The Chinese were working for less, and that they were working longer hours, and therefore they would cause an economic impact. And so that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, that basically after the first 2 or 3 iterations, it became permanent. And so under the Chinese Exclusion Act, no Chinese laborers could enter the United States. And that was interpreted to also include women. And so, and especially women. And so when the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect, the beginning of the so-called bachelor society in Chinatowns grew, And so the ratio of Chinese men to Chinese women by the 1950s and 60s was 10-1. And you couple that with anti-miscegenation laws in places like California, Oregon, and Washington, meaning that Chinese men could not marry white women. And so the population, of course, of the Chinese community just it was steadily declining until the 1960s, when it began to recover because of changes. At any rate, Chinese exclusion laws became then Asian exclusion laws. First, there was an agreement with Japan in 1907 that no more Japanese laborers could enter. Then there was something called the Asiatic Barred Zone that was passed by Congress in 1917. So in essence, there were no Asians that could immigrate to the United States until the laws changed in the 1960s, 1965. The Eastern and Southern Europeans also were not favorites of the policymakers in the United States. So in 1917, there was a literacy law that was passed, and it was aimed at Jews and Southern and other Southern and Eastern Europeans, that we didn't want low-income people coming to the United States, in spite of what today we know to be etched in the Statue of Liberty. The words of the Statue of Liberty are not in the Constitution anywhere. You should know that. And so everything that was written by Emma Lazarus is not contained in the immigration in any U.S. laws. And so, but that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. The 1917 law wasn't enough to exclude all that were meant to be excluded. So in the 1920s, the Congress passed what was called the National Origins Quota Laws, and what Congress came up with was a formula as to what future immigrants should look like. And it was decided that future immigrants, the proportion of future immigrants beginning in the 1920s, should look exactly like the proportion of the country that different races and ethnicities made up in 1890. So the demographics of the United States in 1890, not counting African slaves, of course, the demographics were used to determine what the proportion of immigrants should be beginning in 1920 under the national origin. So of course, the immigration quotas favored Western Europeans, because that's who made up the vast majority of the population in 1890 in the United States. And that was the law. The National Origins Quota System was a law that existed up until 1965. But in their interim, there were a couple of big wars, and the World War II impacted Congress in an immigration way in a couple different respects. One, in 1943, Congress passed something called the Chinese Repealer. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was actually repealed in 1943. Why? Because Japan's propaganda that was targeting China basically was encouraging China to not support the United States in World War II. Japan's argument was, you Chinese people in China are crazy to support the United States in this war, because look at what the United States is doing to your people in the United States. And so because of that Japanese propaganda, Congress passed the Chinese Repeal Law. And as a result, Chinese immigrants could immigrate beginning in 1943. The quota was 50. Okay. And so 50 Chinese could begin immigrating each year in 1943. And similarly, the Philippines the United States took possession of the Philippines in 1898 at the end of the Spanish-American War. the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War, and one of the prizes, I guess you could say, was the United States took possession of the Philippines after Spain had occupied the Philippines for, I think it was 500 years. And so the United States instilled English as the main language of instruction in the Philippines beginning in 1898. And that's why, well, Spain explains why many Filipinos are Catholic. The United States explains why Filipino immigrants also speak English. But a strange thing did happen. The Philippines was a very, very strong ally of the United States during World War II. And as a reward, the United States also granted liberation, if you will, to the Philippines in the middle of World War II. And so there's something called the Philippine Independence Act that was passed in the late 1930s and that came to fruition in 1946. But then because Filipinos were also in the Asiatic barred zone, they could not immigrate. So except for Chinese with 50, that was kind of the only Asian group that could immigrate. And Harry Truman actually very much voiced opposition to the national origins quota system, but he never got his way. Dwight Eisenhower voiced opposition to the national origins quota system. John Kennedy won a Pulitzer Prize before he became president for writing a book attacking the national origins quota system. And he, when he became president, he actually introduced very progressive immigration legislation that would have created a first come, first serve immigration system, irrespective of where people were from. He believed that the United States should have an egalitarian immigration system and that our system of favoring one ethnic group over another was not something that the United States should be proud of. And Truman and Eisenhower also felt the same way. He introduced that legislation, and after his assassination, there was some concern that Lyndon Johnson might not take the mantle of the immigration legislation, but history proved us wrong. Lyndon Johnson pushed through not just Civil Rights Act of 1964, but he also, with Ted Kennedy, who was in the Senate at that time, and also Robert Kennedy, who had been Attorney General. And in those days, he was Attorney General. In those days, the Department of Justice, that is overseen by the Attorney General, had control over immigration enforcement. And so the two surviving at that time, Kennedy brothers and Lyndon Johnson, pushed through the 1965 immigration reforms. But instead of a first come, first served system, the system that was passed then is very, very much what we have today, which is a per country numerical limitation. And there's an unlimited number for relatives of certain U.S. citizens. Spouses is the big example of that. So there's unlimited numbers of visas available for spouses of U.S. citizens. That's why that category is so popular. But otherwise, in 1965, it was about 20,000 visas per country. And that was the new system. Today, it's about 26,000 per country. So it's not that much different. The system in 1965 was primarily family-based immigration. The system today continues to be primarily family-based, although employment-based visas were expanded in 1990. But employment-based visas in our area, anyway, are dominated by what we see in Silicon Valley, but it's not limited to tech. It can be pretty much any business in the United States that is looking for qualified workers can actually benefit from immigration. But still, 80% of immigrants that come to the United States today come through a family-based immigration. And it can be spouses, it can be children, it can be siblings, it cannot be cousins, it's not uncles, it's not grandparents. It's what Congress has determined to be nuclear family. And again, it includes spouses, it includes siblings, but otherwise it's children, married children, it can be parents of U.S. citizens who are adults, and that's pretty much it. It's very controversial because there's very serious backlogs because of that per country numerical limitation. There are very serious backlogs. So, for example, Mexico and the Philippines, in the sibling category, for example, of U.S. citizens, the wait is about 20 years. And so it's pretty, some people call those useless categories. I don't call them useless because I know people who have waited the 20, 25 years, and when they arrive, they're still very happy to come to the United States. And so I've seen quite a bit of this, what I'm describing today, firsthand. Obviously, I wasn't around 1882, but I have been practicing immigration law since I graduated from law school in 1974. So I've been an immigration lawyer for about almost 50 years, and so what I've lived through is after the 1965 changes, more Chinese, more Asians beginning to grow. When the 1965 immigration reforms passed, there was something like 1 million Asians in the United States, and that's not many. And so today it's still not that big. Asian Americans are not more than 7% of the total U.S. population. We live in an area where the percentage is much higher. But Asians are not more than 7% of the total U.S. population, and that includes Southeast Asians, people from South Asia, Cambodia, and so I've lived through that, the beginning of more Asian immigration. Then many of us lived through the end of the Vietnam War, and the reason I'm mentioning that is because that's when the Southeast Asian community developed. What many of us know, people who are of Vietnamese descent or Cambodian descent or of Hmong descent, and they're here, those communities that exist, many in California, because of the refugee policies after 1975, when we withdrew from Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And that, I'm mentioning that because that led Ted Kennedy, that experience of, there have been ad hoc refugee admissions after every war, but that experience led Ted Kennedy and Elizabeth Holtzman, who was in the House, to introduce what became the 1980 Refugee Act. And the 1980 Refugee Act pretty much governs the refugee and asylum system today. So today, the distinction is a refugee is someone who obtains a refugee visa out of the United States, outside, and enters with a refugee visa. An asylee is someone who makes it to the United States, maybe crossing the southern border illegally, maybe coming on a visitor's visa or a student visa, but getting here and then saying they're afraid to go back and they apply for asylum. The President of the United States every year determines how many refugees from abroad can enter. That is now in the statute. Prior to 1980, it was all ad hoc. Now, every summer, the President announces how many new refugees will be admitted and from what parts of the world they will be admitted for the following fiscal year. So the highs were under Jimmy Carter after Southeast Asia. He often allowed in several 100,000 refugees each year, primarily from Southeast Asia. After he became president, Ronald Reagan pretty much continued that pretty large refugee policy. The other thing about Ronald Reagan is 1986, he passed an Immigration Reform and Control Act that granted amnesty to undocumented immigrants in the United States. 3 million people benefited from Ronald Reagan signing that amnesty provision. The other presidents since Reagan, they often would have, you usually didn't have anything less than 100,000 refugees coming into the United States. Donald Trump, he had the historic low for refugee admissions. In his final year, he designated refugee admissions at 15,000. Okay, and so, as you may recall, he when he ran for president, he was unhappy about potential Syrian refugees, and it wasn't just Central Americans. And while in office, he did everything that he could to close the border. Asylees can be from any part of the world. So when you have a reasonable fear of persecution, you can apply for asylum. The United States grants asylum even under Obama and Biden at a rate of about 25%. It's not that high. When in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, he granted asylum to Guatemalans and El Salvadorans at the rate of about 2%. That was Ronald Reagan, Guatemalans, Salvadorans. Nicaraguans in the 1980s was the other third country at that time that was also having civil war. He granted asylum to Nicaraguans at a rate of about 40%. Why? Because of geopolitics. That everybody, in my experience at that time, suffered very similarly because they were caught in the middle of civil wars. In fact, the Supreme Court case that I helped to handle, Cardoso Fonseca, that is a Nicaraguan case. And but the country, not just Ronald Reagan, didn't like the incoming president of Nicaragua at that time, who was Daniel Ortega, who was very left-leaning, and instead we aligned with the right-wing governments of Guatemala and El Salvador, unfortunately, a lot of awful things happened in all three countries, and most notably in El Salvador was the murder and killing and rape of many Jesuit nuns and priests in El Salvador at the time in the 1980s. Today, there are three still primary, this is less true as the days pass, but there are three primary Central American countries that are sending today, and they are Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, rather than Nicaragua. And that's why I started the most recent iteration of immigration clinics in my life at USF, was because of what we saw coming at the border, and they were primarily from those three countries. But there are more and more Mexicans now, and more Nicaraguans, more and more Venezuelans from Latin America. And they are fleeing not because of civil war, but it's more gang, it's more cartel violence, and it's more domestic violence. And so if you present the case correctly, you can win on all three grounds, on any of those three grounds: cartel violence, gang violence, or domestic violence. And the Biden administration and the Obama administration are granting for those countries probably around 30 to 40%. And still not perfect, and it's still very difficult, and usually it's because there's insufficient evidence, people don't bring the death threats with them, and also because the vast majority of individuals are not represented. And so if you're represented in an immigration hearing, you have a 70% chance of winning. If you're not represented in an immigration hearing, you have under 15% chance of winning. And there's not a right to an attorney in immigration proceedings as there is in a criminal case, for example. And that's true for unaccompanied minors. Half of our caseload, we have a caseload at our office at USF of 500 cases. And you should know that part of that is San Mateo County. We are one of 6 agencies that get money from San Mateo County to represent people in San Mateo County. Our office primarily serves the coast side. So we do a lot of work in Half Moon Bay and Pescadero with the agencies there. And but the question earlier about when I walked in rudely, sorry, on the victim of a domestic violence assault, if that person's facing removal, one of the 6 agencies will take that case, and it's San Mateo Legal Aid is the fiscal agent, and so that's where they have the wait list. And we take cases off the wait list. And so we only represent people that are facing deportation. So if it's somebody who wants to apply affirmatively for some benefit, there has to be other funding for that if possible. I want to bring us up to date because, as I said, President Trump had a philosophy of basically not wanting, he really didn't want new immigrants of color. And so it wasn't just at the border, but it was in all kinds of visas. He was trying to stop student visas for a while. He instituted what people call the travel ban or the Muslim ban within his first week in office. It wreaked havoc at airports, and his third iteration of that law was upheld by the Supreme Court. And so the Muslim ban, I can't remember how many countries were on that list finally. Not until Joe Biden took over was the Muslim ban formally terminated. But primarily what I saw was affecting the folks that we represent, that he made it very difficult for people to come across the border. And the most publicity that continues today has to do with Title 42, which is a code word for using the pandemic as a reason for closing the border for all new asylum applicants at the border. Interestingly enough, while Trump strong-armed CDC into supporting that, Anthony Fauci and other medical experts immediately said, no, when you balance human rights with health care, you can strike a balance and satisfy both. If you're concerned about the pandemic, then we should screen people, we should vaccinate them when the vaccination became, and we can isolate them if they're infected. But if they're legitimate asylum seekers, we should still let them apply for asylum while we control that. And so President Biden has been, frankly, two-faced about Title 42. Mm-hmm. He said that he would cancel Title 42. It took him more than a year to then make that order. Then he was sued by conservative states. Texas is the leader here, saying, hey, you can't end Title 42 like that. And he fought that, but then he changed his mind in the middle and said, oh, well, maybe we should continue Title 42. And it's been a puzzle to immigrant rights advocates. The long and short of it is today, Title 42 has been ordered by a federal appellate court to be terminated on December 21st. Okay, so folks are gearing up for an onslaught of asylum seekers that are going to be coming across, and they'll be coming to places like Northern California for sure. And as you know, those who have been able to get in under exceptions of Title 42, they've been used as political pawns by people like Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis Florida, and Texas, literally shipping people off to sanctuary cities, sending them to Chicago and Massachusetts, saying, here, you're a sanctuary city, you should take these folks. And they've misled individuals by enticing them to take bus fare and airfare to these other places. And that's where we are. And is there a solution to any of this? Well, legislation would help. And one thing that I haven't talked about is dreamers. As many of you know, dreamers are individuals who were brought to the United States by their parents at young ages, and either across the border without inspection or on visas, and they overstay their visas, but the kids have grown up here. They've gone to high school here with many of our children, and they're very, very Americanized, and they go to college, and some are in medical school, and some engineers. Some are regular everyday workers, and so in 2000, Senator Dick Durbin, and at that time a congressman from Los Angeles, whose name escapes me, he's no longer there, they introduced the first DREAM Act in 2000, which would grant legalization to somebody who came as a little kid, who went to high school here, who's never gotten in trouble, and they would be granted a green card and a pathway to citizenship. And the DREAM Act has had bipartisan support for many years, but it never has passed. And it's 20 some years later that the DREAM Act hasn't passed. And many of us are advocating that there should be legalization similar to what Ronald Reagan did for what's estimated to be a total of 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants to the United States. Dianne Feinstein has always advocated for legalization for agricultural workers. There's been advocacy for essential workers who helped during the pandemic, that they should be granted legalization. None of that has gotten anywhere. The last 2 weeks, there's been a very strong effort to at least try to get the DREAM Act passed. And the version, again, before the House Speaker becomes Kevin McCarthy rather than Nancy Pelosi, and the most recent version of the DREAM Act was introduced by Kristen Sinema of Arizona, and I can't remember what his first name is. Rob Tillis he's a Republican from another state. They've gotten together, and Kristen Sinema is somewhere between a Democrat and an independent or something like that. I guess she's an independent now. But the trade-off is that Title 42 would be extended one more year.
Wow.
Okay, and so I have been asked by my students and reporters whether or not I would take that trade-off, and I think I would, because I originally heard that what the original trade-off was going to be for the DREAM Act was much worse. That it was ending certain family immigration categories. In other words, a statutory change, that there would be billions more dollars at the southern border to militarize the border even more, kind of thing. And so I know that the harshness of that, of Title 42, I know how harsh it's been, because my students and I go to the border a couple times a year, and so we talk to these folks that are waiting, and it's not a pretty situation, and they will suffer. They would suffer another year, but I don't know. That's the way I'm feeling today. Let me stop there and open up to some questions or comments. I've left out a lot of information, so I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have.